By the final months of 1513, silence had settled over the French court. Queen Anne of Brittany lay ill in her chamber at Blois, her strength fading after years of exhaustion and loss. She was 46 and had endured 16 pregnancies, most ending in tragedy. The strain had weakened her heart and lungs, and by December she could no longer stand. Her legs were swollen with fluid, her breath came shallow and uneven, and her voice was reduced to a whisper. The physicians who attended her tried every known remedy, yet nothing eased her pain. Her body no longer obeyed, and each day she slipped further from the life around her. As the winter deepened, hope among the court began to fade. The corridors outside her room grew quiet, and servants moved like shadows, afraid to disturb the stillness. The king's council met in secrecy, weighing what remained to be done. By the beginning of January 1514 the physicians had been dismissed and the priests summoned. Medicine had failed, and only prayer was thought to hold meaning. From that moment, the queen's chamber belonged to the church. Candles burned beside her bed without rest, relics were placed near her hands, and the low hum of psalms filled the air day and night. The room smelled of smoke, oil, and fading flowers. The queen remained conscious, though her strength was nearly gone. She spoke little, her lips moving without sound, her eyes half open as she drifted in and out of sleep. Those who stood watch noticed that her pulse weakened but did not vanish, and that her chest rose from time to time in faint, uneven rhythm. No one dared to test whether she still lived. No mirror was held to her lips, no hand pressed to her heart. The priests had already declared that her soul was leaving her body, and what could still be measured no longer mattered. On the night of January 8 her breathing grew faint and irregular. The priests gathered around her bed and began the prayers for the dying, their voices rising and falling in the glow of the candles. The air was thick with incense and the sound of murmured Latin. Her attendants stood apart, weeping quietly as holy water was sprinkled over the bed. Just before dawn her breathing stopped for several moments, and the chief cleric proclaimed that the queen had died. No physician was called. No verification was made. The statement was written into the royal record before sunrise, and the bells of Blois began to ring in mourning. The council met that morning to decide what must follow. Delay was considered dangerous. The death of the queen threatened to shake both court and country. The church forbade any medical inspection of the body. Only the heart was to be removed and preserved in gold, to be sent to Nantes according to her wish. The rest would be sealed for burial without examination. When the embalmers entered the chamber, they found warmth still in her skin and color on her lips. One whispered that her chest seemed to move, but the priests silenced him with prayer. The embalming continued under watch of the clergy. Oils were poured, linen wrapped, wax pressed with the royal seal. By afternoon the body was placed in a coffin lined with lead, pale but untouched by decay. The order for burial had already been signed. That night the bells of Blois tolled again while candles burned beside the closed coffin. Outside, the court prepared for the long journey to Saint-Denis. The people believed their queen rested in peace, but her body had not yet crossed the line between life and death. Faith had replaced reason, and in the name of order Anne of Brittany was buried while traces of life still lingered within her. Morning came to Blois cold and gray, and the sound of the bells that had tolled through the night still drifted over the courtyards and across the Loire. Inside the palace the corridors were heavy with silence, broken only by the slow steps of servants who obeyed orders without speaking. The queen's death had been written into the record before dawn, and now the council gathered behind closed doors to decide what must follow. No one questioned the news. No one dared to speak of uncertainty. France had lost its queen, and her passing had to look unquestionable. The men around the table spoke quickly and quietly. The burial had to be arranged before rumors could spread, before anyone could suggest that the queen might still be alive. The church would direct the rites. The procession would leave for Saint-Denis within 2 days, and the coffin would be sealed that very afternoon. Physicians were not to interfere. Any doubt would be seen as blasphemy. Faith would define truth, and the record would stand unchanged. When the priests returned to the chamber, they found the same stillness that had filled it through the night. The candles burned low, the air smelled of wax and incense, and the queen lay as they had left her, motionless beneath the folds of white linen. Her attendants had not slept. They whispered that her skin was still warm, that her lips held color, that her chest seemed to rise now and then, but their words stopped when the priests entered. What was seen by the eye no longer mattered. What the church declared was what the world would believe. The embalmers were brought in before noon. They moved slowly, reluctant to touch the queen's body, but the clerics urged them to begin. Prayers were read between each step of the work. The ointments were poured, the wrappings prepared, and the scent of spices filled the chamber until the air itself felt heavy. The men worked in silence, their faces pale and damp with sweat. They did not speak of the warmth they felt beneath the skin or the faint softness that still lingered in her hands. One of them crossed himself again and again, afraid to look too closely. Outside, the palace stirred into order. Courtiers dressed in mourning robes, messengers carried letters to Paris, and the heralds rode out to announce the queen's death across the realm. The king remained unseen, hidden in prayer or grief, while the council oversaw the preparations with the calm precision of ceremony. Every movement, every word, every decision was meant to show control. The queen's death was no longer a tragedy but a ritual of power. By the time the sun began to sink, the coffin stood ready in the chapel. It was made of oak and lined with lead, its edges polished to a dull shine that caught the light of the candles. The queen's body, wrapped and sealed, was lifted inside by slow, careful hands. The priests recited the final blessings, and the wax bearing the royal crest was pressed upon the lid. The air in the chapel was cold, but the smell of incense clung to every surface. The few attendants who remained swore later that they saw the fabric of the shroud shift, though none spoke it aloud. As night returned, the bells tolled again. Horses stamped in the courtyard as the procession assembled under a pale winter moon. The coffin was placed upon a black-draped cart surrounded by torches that swayed in the wind. Clergy and nobles took their positions, their faces gray in the torchlight. The city gathered to watch in silence as the cortege began to move. The bells followed them out of Blois, and their sound faded into the night. Behind the sealed lid, beneath the weight of wood and lead, the queen's body remained warm. Whether breath still stirred within her chest, no one would ever know. The world had already decided she was dead. The journey from Blois to Saint-Denis took several days through frozen fields and gray villages where the people knelt in silence as the procession passed. The coffin moved slowly under heavy cloth, surrounded by torches that burned through wind and snow. The clergy rode ahead, chanting the same verses that had followed her since the morning of her supposed death. Behind them came the nobles of the court, their faces hidden by black veils, and the guards who kept the crowd from pressing too close. No one spoke, and even the horses seemed subdued by the weight of the journey. The people bowed as the queen passed, believing that her spirit had already risen, unaware that within the sealed coffin her body still held the last traces of life. When the cortege reached Paris, the bells of the city rang from dawn until dusk. Streets were lined with banners marked with the royal fleur-de-lis, and the air smelled of wax and smoke from thousands of candles lit in mourning. The coffin rested overnight in the chapel of Notre Dame, surrounded by soldiers who kept vigil as clerics read psalms through the long hours. Witnesses said the night was unnaturally cold, yet when one of the guards approached the coffin, he swore he felt a faint warmth coming from within. He told no one until years later. By morning, the procession moved again, climbing the road toward Saint-Denis, where the kings and queens of France were laid to rest. The abbey waited in silence, its gates open, the interior dark except for the candles that glowed along the high stone walls. The sound of chanting filled the nave as the coffin was carried inside and set before the altar. The abbot performed the final rites, speaking of virtue, devotion, and sacrifice. Every word was recorded by scribes, every gesture made in strict ceremony. The priests declared that the queen's body would now join the company of the faithful dead, united with the saints and monarchs who had ruled before her. The coffin was opened briefly so the highest clergy might anoint the wrappings one last time. Those who stood near later said that the skin beneath the linen was still soft, that no decay had begun, that the air inside the box held the warmth of a living body. But the abbot ordered the seal replaced at once. The final prayers continued, and the lead cover was soldered shut while smoke from the candles hung low around the altar. When the last prayer was spoken, the great bells of Saint-Denis sounded above the chanting voices, deep and hollow, echoing through the stone vaults. The burial followed immediately. The coffin was lowered into the crypt among the tombs of past monarchs, surrounded by priests holding torches that flickered in the cold air. Wax dripped onto the flagstones as the mass ended and the crowd began to disperse. The abbey grew quiet again, the echo of the ceremony fading beneath the arches. Above the tomb, the priests sealed the slab and placed a wreath of lilies upon it. The queen had been given to the earth. The rites were complete, the court was satisfied, and France could mourn without uncertainty. Only a few who had witnessed the burial left the abbey uneasy. Some had noticed a faint sound, a muffled shift within the coffin before the stone was placed, but none dared to speak of it. In the eyes of the church the queen was dead, and no one could question what had been done in God's name. The crypt was closed, and the torches were extinguished one by one, leaving only the lingering smell of wax and incense in the dark. Above, the bells of Saint-Denis rang once more, declaring that the queen had found her eternal rest, though her body beneath the stone had never been allowed to prove it. Years passed before the silence of Saint-Denis was broken. The court changed, kings came and went, but the queen's tomb remained untouched beneath the stone floor of the abbey. The monks who tended the crypt passed by her resting place each day, lighting candles for the souls of the dead and sweeping away the dust that gathered between the slabs. For a time her name was spoken only in prayers, her story already fading into the calm order of royal memory. Yet whispers began to stir again decades later, born from the same curiosity that always follows the dead of noble blood. When repairs were ordered in the lower chapel, the workers who opened the vaults found the air within strangely warm and dry despite the passing of years. They broke the seals of several tombs to inspect their state, and among them was the coffin of Anne of Brittany. The wax bearing the royal crest had darkened with age, but the marks of the seal were still visible. As the lead covering was lifted, those present expected to find only dust and bone. Instead they saw the shape of a body still whole beneath the wrappings, the linen yellowed but not consumed. The scent that escaped was not of decay but of metal and oil. One monk who assisted in the work later wrote that when they cut through the outer layers of cloth, the hands of the queen were crossed on her chest and the fingers slightly bent, as though they had moved after death. Another swore that the linen around her face bore small tears, and that the fabric near her mouth was darkened, not by time, but by breath that had come too late. The abbot ordered silence and forbade any record to be kept beyond the official report, which described the remains as incorrupt and blessed. The coffin was closed again, sealed and hidden from the eyes of the workers before more could be said. Outside the abbey, the rumors spread at once. They began as whispers among the masons and spread to the streets of Paris before the week was done. It was said that the queen had not been dead when she was laid in the tomb, that her body had struggled against the wrappings, that she had awakened in the dark only to die again beneath the stone. Some spoke of scratches found on the inner lid, others claimed that the wax seal had been pressed from within. No one could prove it, but no one could forget it either. The story moved from city to city, and soon every tavern and every marketplace repeated the same words: the Queen of France had been buried alive. The church denied it. Officials from Saint-Denis wrote letters to the court insisting that the tale was false, that the body had been untouched and pure, and that any claim otherwise was an insult to sacred tradition. But denial only strengthened belief. Painters began to show the queen as a saintly figure, pale and serene, trapped within her coffin like a relic of faith itself. Poets wrote verses calling her the bride of death and the silent mother of Brittany, and common people lit candles in her memory not for her soul, but for her suffering. The rumor became legend, and the legend outlived the truth. The more the church silenced it, the more it grew. Even within the abbey, some monks confessed that they prayed for her not as a saint, but as a victim. In the dim light of the crypt, where wax melted and shadows moved across the stone, the air seemed to hold her presence still, a warning, a sorrow, and a secret that none dared to speak aloud. The story of the Queen's death and the silence that followed her burial became part of the memory of France. Generations passed, yet her name remained in the whispers of those who feared the power of the Church and the blindness of obedience. The chronicles of her reign spoke of treaties, heirs, and alliances, but beyond the lines of ink another tale endured, carried not by scholars but by ordinary voices. It told of a woman who ruled and suffered, whose life had been taken not by time but by faith. In the cities and villages her story changed with each telling. Some said she had awakened inside the coffin, her hands striking the wood until blood marked the wrappings. Others claimed that she had opened her eyes in darkness, praying until her breath ran out. A few said she had never woken at all, that her spirit lingered instead, moving between the walls of Saint-Denis where the bells still echoed her name. Each version ended the same way: the Queen remained silent, and France continued to call her blessed. Writers began to use her story as a lesson. They spoke of the danger of haste, of faith placed above reason, of the fear that silence brings. In the courts of Europe her death was discussed in half-voices, as an example of how the sacred could swallow the human. The Church refused to recognize the rumor but never dared to investigate the tomb again. The records stayed closed, and the silence became proof enough. Centuries later, when historians searched the archives, they found only fragments: a letter from a monk, a damaged seal, a note describing unusual preservation. Nothing that could confirm what people believed, yet nothing that could erase it. The absence of truth became its own kind of evidence. Her image began to appear in paintings as a figure of stillness, eyes closed, lips pale, surrounded by the symbols of both royalty and confinement. To the people who saw them, she was no longer a queen but a reflection of every soul trapped between faith and flesh. In time her legend moved beyond the borders of Brittany and France. It entered the language of superstition, the warnings told to young brides about obedience and silence. The story no longer belonged to the court or the church. It belonged to the people who repeated it by candlelight and passed it on in fear and wonder. In Saint-Denis, the tomb still stands among the others, unmarked by any sign of what was said to have happened there. Visitors pass it without knowing, hearing only the echo of their own steps beneath the vaults. Yet those who linger, who stand in the cold air long enough to listen, say the silence there feels different. It is deeper, heavier, as though something beneath the stone is still waiting. Whether it is faith, memory, or the last breath of a queen who was never allowed to die, no one can tell. The only certainty that remains is that her story did not end with her burial, and perhaps never will.